All right, welcome back. So last time we finished up non-traditional training. So we covered bodyweight training, strongman training, and a variety of other, different methodologies. So this time moving on to chapter 17, program design for resistance training. So this chapter, one of the good things about it is that it is very practical. There are a lot of really helpful charts, like if you lift a certain percentage over your one repetition max, how many repetitions you should be able to do, charts about rest time between sets, good information on the number of repetitions to improve muscular power, to improve strength, hypertrophy, etc. So there's a lot of good information in this chapter. Now that said, the way that it's set up, there are the slideshow itself is pretty encompassing. There's not a lot of information I'm going to be able to add. I'll try to give you some examples to make things make a little bit more sense where they might not. But otherwise, the key information in this one is really on the slideshow. So this one, in terms of program design, actually runs through 7 different steps that you should go through when you're setting up a strength training program for an athlete or for a team of athletes. So here's the basic order of things. And we're going to run through each of these individually. So the first thing to do is a needs analysis. And as you'll see, a lot of the stuff we covered in in coaching 345 in the program design class, as you would expect. So some of this is kind of a rehash of that. But we'll run through our needs analysis once we've decided the needs of the athlete, both from a biomechanical standpoint and from an energy demand standpoint and from an individual athlete standpoint. Once we've done that needs analysis, then we'll start picking out exercises, then trying to figure out how many days per week they're going to exercise, which is the training frequency. Obviously, that's going to vary throughout the training year. In the off season, they're going to train more times per week, and then in season, maybe it's down to 1 or 2. Exercise order. So once we've picked the exercises we're going to do, we'll design the workout and include the order in which they fit. And then training load and repetitions, how heavy are you lifting, how many times, volume, so related to repetitions, but also the number of sets, and then rest periods, how long between, which of course is going to vary depending upon the goals of the training. The rest periods are shorter if you're working on muscular endurance, they're longer if you're working on muscular strength and power. All right, so without further ado, the needs analysis. So as you can see there, 2-step process involves evaluation of the requirements and characteristics of the sport. So in thinking about that, and actually I won't build on that too much for now because that's actually the next slide. So we'll leave it at that for now. And then the second step is the assessment of the athlete. So as far as the evaluation of the sport goes, so there's the movement analysis of the sport, so body and limb movement patterns. So is this a sport, like baseball? So if we're thinking about somebody like a baseball pitcher, is this a sport that requires a lot of rotational power, or is this a sport more like, or are we dealing with an athlete more like a football offensive lineman, where they do obviously have to do some lateral movement, but a lot of what they're going to do, and this will depend upon the scheme that your team runs, but let's say we're a run-heavy team, a lot of what they're going to do is just pushing straight forward. Now, again, there's some lateral movement involved there, but it's more sagittal plane type motion. And then if we have a pitching athlete or a throwing athlete, there's a lot more transverse or horizontal plane type motion. So that would be part of the movement analysis of the sport. We're also going to do a physiological analysis. So, what are the metabolic demands of the sport? Is it a power sport? Is it aerobic endurance? Is it one where muscular hypertrophy is going to matter? So again, with your football offensive lineman. And then injury analysis. So if we're dealing with our football offensive linemen, what are some common injury concerns for them? Football offensive linemen tend to have like thumb injuries. There's some of these that we can't really prevent, a lot of finger and thumb injuries, but concussions. And so maybe we can do some more neck work with these athletes, have them do lots of deadlifts and Olympic variants and shrugs and those kind of things to try to work on strengthening of the neck musculature. And then obviously you can do some independent neck exercises. So that would be part of the injury analysis. Or if we're working with like a soccer athlete that's very quad dominant, as we'll talk about later. And so the quads are ACL antagonists. They do the motion that the ACL resists, or one of them, they slide the tibia forward. And so one of the things that we'll do for our soccer athletes is really emphasize hamstring strengthening to try to minimize the risk of ACL injuries in those athletes. So all of those things go into the evaluation of the sport. So how do they normally move in the sport? What energy systems do they use? And then what joints, what muscles are most likely to be injured, and how can we prevent that. Then we need to look at the individual athlete. So here are the typical things we need to work on in this sport, but our particular athlete has these deficits. So maybe they lack dorsiflexion range of motion. Maybe they lack rotator cuff strength, those kinds of things. So other things that we'll consider, primarily their training status. So you can see, again, lots of handy tables. So if they are a beginner athlete, so let's say we have, a high school freshman or a middle school athlete, and they're just getting into this, they're not training, their training age is less than 2 months. So we're going to have them train 1 to 2 times a week with pretty low training stress. So we're not going to do, heavy weights, we're not going to do fast movements yet. We're mostly working on form with them. As opposed to, now we got maybe a sophomore athlete that has trained before and is currently training coming into the season. They've been training, let's say, for a few months. So we'll have them do a higher volume, so 2 to 3 times, and then we'll increase the training stress. We're still going to do some pretty basic stuff with them. So we're going to do, kind of the core lifts, so things like squats and deadlifts and presses. Not going to do a lot of really complicated like Olympic variants with them until they get to be more advanced, and then we'll do heavier weights, that's the higher training stress, and potentially just overall heavier loads, right? So one of the things that we talked about in the Coaching 345 class is that load can sometimes be used to discuss the amount of weight on the bar, or it can be used to discuss the combination of sets, reps, that's what I was going for, I sounded like Elmer Fudd there, sets, reps, and weight, right? And then we can do some more complicated lifts with them. So, yeah, all right, that's all covered. So, other things about the assessment of the athlete. So, obviously, ideally, we would test them, and are looking at their strengths and deficits is based on testing. So maybe we assess their muscular strength. We have them do some 1-rep maxes. Maybe we look at their agility. Have them do a 505 test and assess their ability to absorb body weight, their power in moving their body weight, which affects their ability to change directions, those kinds of things. And then obviously a really important thing here is going to be our primary resistance training goal. Does this athlete need to add mass? Do they need to add power, increase their muscular endurance? What is it that they need to work on? Because that goal is then going to drive the rest of our decisions with respect to the number of sets, the intensity of the weight, the number of repetitions, all those kinds of things. So the primary resistance training goal is going to be pretty key. That's going to drive a lot of the rest of the program. Other things here. So as we discussed in the Coaching 345 class, the priorities do shift some throughout the training year. So we focus on things like muscular hypertrophy, so muscular growth and putting on size in the off season. Usually we're not going to have our in-season athletes trying to do something like that. They're obviously going to train more days per week, so 4 to 6. I'm thinking of like a football player here. Have them train 4 to 6 days a week. Relatively high repetitions, like 6 to 12 repetitions. And then have them try to put on some additional mass. Then once they get into the season, we're going to start to do some more specific things. So the exercises that we have them do are going to more closely mimic the movements of the sport, but also they're going to start moving at the speed of sport. So rather than doing really heavy, slow squats, maybe we'll have them do some higher speed, lower intensity, so lower weight box squats, or we'll have them do some of the Olympic variants, those kinds of things. So when I say Olympic variants, I mean things like power cleans, push jerks, power snatches, hang snatches, those kinds of things would be variants on the 2 Olympic lifts, which again are the clean and jerk and then the snatch. So once we've done our analysis, we figured out the needs of the sport, or the demands of the sport really, and then the needs of the athlete. Where are their deficits? Where are their strengths? What are we working toward? What are our training goals? Then we can start picking out exercises that correspond with the demands of the sport and that correspond with the needs of the athlete. So in terms of exercise selection, things to consider. So the movement requirements of the sport, as we talked about, the athlete's ability to perform those exercises. A key one that people don't think about here sometimes in designing programs is the equipment available. I know it sounds pretty intuitive, but oftentimes people will design these really great programs and they may not have the equipment for them. So for example, maybe you have a high school weight room that has lots of power racks and barbells and bumpers and all that stuff, but there aren't any pulleys. So, you designed your program to involve a lot of like lat pull downs and tricep press downs and those kinds of things. But if you don't have pulleys, you can't do those things. So be sure you get a rundown of the equipment available. And in thinking about the equipment available, if you only have one pulley machine, like let's say you have one lat pull down, that's probably not something you want to emphasize in the programming for an entire football team. If you got 50 athletes in the weight room at that time, or even 30 athletes in the weight room at that time, you're not really going to be able to cycle people through that pulley machine. So maybe that's something that they do in supplemental weight training, like before school or after school, that kind of a thing. And then other things to think about: the amount of training time available. Oftentimes we won't have a ton of time with athletes, typically an hour or less. And so for our programming, we really want to concentrate on what are going to be referred to as the core lifts in the future slides. So the core lifts are basically multi-joint lifts. So you're probably not going to spend a lot of time, doing things like during the athletic period, whether that's during the school day or before or after. You're probably not going to spend a bunch of time doing like bicep curls and tricep press downs and calf raises and that kind of stuff. If the athlete has time in a supplemental session, that stuff's great. But for our limited time that we have with them for the hour, we're probably going to focus more on things like squats, presses, like I said, deadlifts, maybe barbell rows, those kinds of things. Oh, there we go. Core exercises right there. So one of the things to be aware of is in this chapter, core exercises does not refer to the core musculature. So we're not referring to the rectus abdominis, the obliques, transverse abdominis, any of that stuff. Core exercises in this chapter refers to multi-joint exercises. So again, things like the squat, because that's going to involve the low back, the hips, and the knees. Bench press, shoulders and elbows. Those are core type exercises. They're multi-joint exercises. So as you can see, they receive priority. So we're gonna do those first, and if we have time, we'll do like the single joint exercises. So we'll make sure the athletes squat, and then if we have time, maybe you have them do leg curls or something like that, right? Assistance exercises, speaking of leg curls, those leg curls would fall under that category of assistance exercises. So these are often one joint exercises or unijoint exercises. So again, things like bicep curls, tricep extensions, leg curls, calf raises, all of those would be assistance exercises because they only involve one joint or primarily involve one joint. And so one of the ways that I tend to conceptualize the assistance exercises are those that are often included in bodybuilding programs. So if they're really trying to focus on, increasing the size of their upper arm, they're going to do variations on curls. So, normal easy bar curls and hammer curls and reverse curls and all that kind of stuff. That's a bodybuilding type thing. And again, typically with sports, we don't have enough time to do that. So we tend to focus in designing performance enhancement programs on multi-joint exercises. Related, and just to make things a little more complicated, so most of the core exercises, which again are multi-joint exercises in this chapter, are also structural exercises, which means that they load the spine directly or indirectly. So this guy that's doing a front squat, that is a structural exercise in that it's going to load the spine, just like a back squat will and a deadlift and all of the Olympic variants. All of those are going to be structural exercises, as opposed to something like a dumbbell press, like thinking here of a supine, so they're laying on their back on the bench, doing a dumbbell press. That's not going to load the spine. That's not a structural exercise. Other things like lat pull downs or dumbbell rows, those are not structural exercises because they don't load the spine. So that's the terminology there. So basically with the structural exercises, they're almost always, not always, but almost always barbell exercises. So like I said, squats and the variants thereof, deadlifts, not really a lot of variants on deadlifts, but kind of, and then the Olympic lifts. Now you could throw in there things like lunges and box jumps and that kind of stuff, but we'll just leave it at that. Power exercises, those are ones where you move fast. So those include typically the Olympic exercises and the variants thereof. So like I said, power cleans, hang snatches, power snatches, etc. Those are all moving the weight quickly. Box squats usually fall in that group too. And then your plyometrics would fall under power exercises. All right, so sport-specific exercises. So if we need to strengthen particular muscle groups or strengthen movements of the sport, we might select exercises that mimic those movements. So for example, if we have a tennis athlete, maybe we're going to have them do flat dumbbell flies. Although, one of the things we've talked about before is moving from more general exercises to more specific exercises. So maybe for our tennis player, we have them do dumbbell flies early in the off season, and then as we get closer to the season, now we have them do something more like a standing one-arm cable fly, because that's going to more closely mimic the movements of their sport, because now they're on the ground as they will be in their sport, not on the bench, and using one arm at a time as they generally will in their sport as well. So that's something to think about as you're designing your programs for the end of the class, for that final project in the class, is, you know, how can you move from general to specific in a similar fashion to this. Other things like for rowing, so the power clean is going to mimic that triple extension that you're going to get in a competitive rowing stroke. So, you know, where you're going to go low back, knees, and to some extent ankles, and then in the case of a row, they're also going to involve the upper body. So then, you know, variants thereof, those kinds of things. So one of the things, there's a question in the quiz bank about this, so be familiar with this acronym because it's something you'll see a lot. So the SAID principle is specific adaptation to imposed demands. The idea is that the body responds to the demands placed on it. So, you know, we've talked about this before, where if you do endurance training, so if you do low intensity running, for example, for, you know, 30, 45 minutes, the body is going to adapt by, in the trained muscle fibers, so let's say in the quads and calves, in some of those trained muscle fibers, you'll get more capillaries, more mitochondria, more aerobic enzymes, that kind of stuff. And then conversely, if you went the other way and you did really high intensity, so heavy weight resistance training, so you did, you know, squats, let's say, for 2 repetitions at 95% of your 1 repetition max, you're going to get a very different set of adaptations. So you're going to get more creatine phosphate, more glycolytic enzymes, more glycogen. The muscle is going to get stronger. It's going to have slightly different neuromuscular recruitment patterns, so more simultaneous recruitment rather than not sequential. I forget the term, but you remember what I'm talking about, where rather than recruiting all the motor units at one time, we recruit only a third of them or only a quarter of them. So because the body adapts in different ways to different demands, we want to train specifically for the sport. So that's, again, movement specificity, but also metabolic specificity. So that's the concept of specific adaptation to imposed demands, or the SAID principle. All right, that's what it was. Synchronous recruitment versus asynchronous recruitment. That's what I was going for. So power exercises or high intensity exercises, synchronous recruitment of the motor units, all of them at one time, versus asynchronous, some of them while others rest, which you get with endurance training. All right, now I feel better. All right, so movement analysis of the sport. So one of the things we want to consider is muscle balance. So if we've got somebody like a rower, they're going to do a lot of extension of the low back, a lot of pulling motion, obviously, so a lot of scapular retraction, a lot of shoulder extension. And so one of the things that we may have them do as part of their programming is to do some pushing type motions to offset all of the pulling that they do as part of their sport. So as you know, the agonists are the prime movers, the antagonists are the muscles that do the opposite. So one thing to consider would be to include some antagonist exercises to the muscles that they develop really strongly in their sport to promote that balance, but also to reduce injury risk. We also would want to include, or could consider including, exercises that promote recovery. So that would include just low intensity exercises. So maybe you have them do like light cycling for 5 and 10 minutes, 5 or 10 minutes, and then you have them do things like foam rolling and stretching, or yoga would fall in here. Those kinds of things tend to promote recovery. In terms of exercise selection, so exercise technique experience, as we've talked about before, don't have your inexperienced athletes doing overhead squats. They can't. That takes a lot of practice, requires a lot of balance and a lot of flexibility, and most athletes won't be able to do that. So don't assume that the athletes are able to perform those exercises, and start with certainly your less advanced ones, even if things like overhead squats are pretty cool. We talked about the availability of equipment and then availability of time per session. So again, you want time efficient exercises. So the core lifts, the multi-joint lifts preferentially, and then whatever time's left over, then we can do some single joint stuff if possible. In terms of training frequency, so that's the number of sessions completed in a given period. In resistance training, the given period is almost always a week. And so typically it is how many times per week do they train? 1 time, 6 times, whatever that number is. That's their training frequency. And that depends upon their training status. So the lower level of athlete, or I guess not necessarily lower level, the less experienced the athlete, the lower their training age, the lower their training status, then you're going to get decreased frequency. So as you can see there, a beginner athlete is only going to train 2 to 3 times per week, intermediate 3 to 4, and then your advanced athlete 4 to 7. And in that 7, they may do some 2-a-days. So they may have, where they work on power movements in the morning, where they do, relatively low weight, fast movement, on the Olympic variants and plyometrics, and then in the afternoon they come back and maybe they do some high intensity like strength kind of stuff. And the more advanced they are, the better they're able to recover between sessions, and so you can stack more sessions more closely together because of that increased experience in conditioning. So as you can see there, you can use split routines with your more advanced athletes. So your beginner athletes are going to do 1 to 2 total body sessions per week versus your high school athletes that have been training for several years, or your collegiate athletes that have been training for a while. We're often going to do split programs with them. So the most basic split programs are upper lower body splits. So we do like squats and deadlifts on Monday, presses and pulls, so bench press, and then like lat pull downs and pull ups on Tuesday, and then some other lower body exercise, some other upper body exercise, right? Then you can do the more classic like bodybuilding splits. So chest, shoulders, and triceps one day, squats or leg press or whatever the next day, and then like pull-ups and shrugs and bicep curls and stuff on Wednesday. So that's a pretty common, like I said, this middle one here, pretty common bodybuilding type split. And then a really similar one here with chest and back, lower body, shoulders and arms. This one's very much bodybuilding thing. And then, you kind of repeat the cycle there. So the most common ones you're going to see in a sport context at the high school and maybe lower collegiate level are more of this stuff. So lower body, upper body kind of a split. But if you're into the season and you're starting to do the Olympic lifts, those are, or the variants thereof, those are pretty well total body lifts, right? All right, and so we talked about this one in 345 as well. So the training frequency varies depending upon the calendar. So in the off season, they may do 4 to 6 training sessions per week. In season, more like 1 to 3. And then post season during the active rest period, 0 to 3. But even then, the exercise sessions that they do are supposed to be pretty non-specific. So maybe they're doing, if you've got a baseball or football player, maybe they're doing some cycling, maybe they're doing some light jogging, those kinds of things that they typically don't do as part of the season. So they're not going to roll right into heavy squats and those kinds of things during that active rest period. So mentioned this one earlier, the top bullet point there about that the the better condition the athlete, the less recovery time that they need, but the higher intensity of the training. So if they're lifting really heavy, so if they're doing 95% of their 1 rep max, they're going to require maybe 2 or 3 days to rest before they start lifting heavy weights like that again. So just the higher intensity of the training, the more rest they're going to need. So something to keep in mind there. And then other things to consider, as we talked about in the 345 class, is their overall training load. So not only are they lifting weights, but they're doing other training, right? They're doing plyometrics, they're doing agility, they're doing other conditioning. They're probably doing some sports skill stuff, and then what else do they have going on? Because as we talked about in that class, that psychological stress from school or work or whatever, that also is going to affect their overall stress and their ability to adapt to the training stresses that you're introducing to them. So keep in mind the things that they're doing outside of the sport as well. In terms of exercise order, so the key point on this one is power, core, then assistance. So we want to do exercises where they move fast first, And then once we've done those, then we're going to do our other core stuff, so the multi-joint exercises, and then, time permitting, the assistance exercises. So for example, this guy's doing a hang clean and jerk. So, we would have them do, let's say, power cleans, which would be our power exercise, followed by front squats, because that's a multi-joint exercise, and then maybe we'd have them do hamstring curls or knee extensions. I know knee extensions are very not in vogue, but something like that is a single joint type exercise that would be classified as an assistance exercise. So I think that would be a pretty good progression here. So like I said, power clean, front squat, hamstring curl. If you really wanted to fry their quads, you could do power clean, front squat, and then knee extensions. Like I said, not in vogue, but that would finish off their quads. All right, other things we can do. So upper and lower body exercises alternated. So you could have them do bench press, squats, and then pull-ups or something like that, and then back to Romanian deadlifts or something. And so the idea there is that while you're doing bench press, your legs are resting, and then you're going to do a bunch of squats, and then your upper body, for the most part, is resting, and then you're going to go back and do pull-ups. And so by doing that, the idea is that you're going to get more rest for the upper or lower body, whichever one's not working at the time. And by having that rest, that time to recover, you're going to get a higher quality of work. They're going to be able to lift heavier weights with that additional rest time. So that's the basic rationale of alternating upper and lower body exercises. You can also alternate push-pull exercises. So you have them do bench press and then, let's say, barbell row or TRX rows, something like that. Same basic idea, but you're still staying within the upper body in that example. Or you could have them do something like leg press and then Romanian deadlift. So by doing the leg press, that's more of a push exercise. The Romanian deadlift is more of a pull exercise. Usually you see these, to be honest, more upper body, but I was trying to come up with a lower body example. So I think that would work. I was trying to avoid two exercises that really challenge the low back. You probably don't want to do a bunch of squats and then follow them with Romanian deadlifts, because that is going to be rough on the low back. Now, it may not bother the athlete, but just, they're going to get a pretty good burn there. So I would do leg press in that example. Supersets versus compound sets. So you'll see this terminology around bodybuilding. So a superset are agonist-antagonist. So that would be the example I mentioned a minute ago of bench press, barbell row. So you're going to use pecs and then rhomboids. So agonist, antagonist. So in that case, your scapular protractors. I know pec minor is the scapular protractor there, and then rhomboids, the scapular retractors in that example. So supersets, then the thing to know, they are antagonistic movements. So you push and then you pull. So another example in the lower body, knee extensions, leg curls, right? So those are push-pull type movements. Compound sets are typically when you do, so you can see two exercises for the same muscle group. Again, a bodybuilding technique for the most part. But what you're going to see here is usually individuals will perform a core exercise of some sort, so multi-joint exercise, followed by a single joint exercise. So that would be something like bench press, followed by dumbbell flies, or squats or leg press, followed by leg extensions. So as you can see from those examples, those are pretty bodybuilding oriented types of things. But if we have an athlete that we want them to put on weight, we can, not to vilify bodybuilding, but we can have them do a more bodybuilding type program if we wanted to facilitate that muscular hypertrophy. And then as we get closer to the season, now we do more specific stuff. All right, a lot of this stuff really repeats what we talked about in Coaching 345. So in terms of quantifying training load, so mechanical work is force times displacement. The volume load is the weight times the reps. So, we talked about having an athlete say that they lifted it's tonnage. It's the tonnage that we talked about in 345. So, let's see. Heavier load, the lower the number of repetitions that can be performed, obviously. So if you're lifting, 95% of your 1 rep max, you're only going to be able to get like 2 repetitions versus 85%, it's more like 6 repetitions, those kinds of things. And based on my example there, you can see bullet point number 2. So we typically quantify the intensity as a percentage of their 1 rep max. So we have them lift as much as they can, let's say 200 pounds, and then when we actually write up a program, we'll base it on the percentages of that. So we want them to do 95% of their 1 rep max or 85% of their 1 rep max or whatever. And based on that percentage, we'll have a pretty good idea of the number of repetitions that they can complete, which is one of the handier slides, one of the handier graphics, which is here, right? So if I want an athlete to be able to perform 6 repetitions, for example, that's going to be 85% of their 1 rep max. If I want them to do sets of 8, that's 80% of their 1 rep max. Sets of 10, 75% of their 1 rep max. So it's helpful to be familiar with kind of those cutoffs. So 10 reps, 75%, 8 reps, 80%, 6 reps, 85%. Just like I said, it's kind of helpful to have those handy in terms of memorization. Load we talked about, 1 rep max we talked about. So 1 rep max is the most weight you can lift one time. A rep max is that you do, let's say, the most weight that they can lift 5 times. So that would be your 5 RM. Or the most weight you can lift 10 times, that's your 10 RM. So that's what a repetition max is. It's the most weight you can lift that number of times. So testing the 1 RM, obviously you want to use core exercises for that. So multi-joint type exercises. We don't usually do 1 RMs and things like curls, although some people do, but it's pretty rare. For the most part, we do things like squats, Olympic variants, presses, etc. Ways to gauge rep maxes. So you can estimate their 1 rep max from a table. So this one, I don't know if people are still doing this. I remember, in the late 90s and early 2000s, this was really in vogue, in part because Nebraska did it, and Nebraska at the time was really dominant, and they were one of the oldest really organized strength and conditioning programs, at least at the collegiate level in the U.S., and so a lot of people kind of copied what Nebraska did. And so they had a big table, and it was like, if you could lift 200 pounds 8 times, here was your 1 rep max. And so those are the prediction equations. And they were often printed in table format. You can do multi-rep max testing. So one of the things is you'll see sometimes coaches are hesitant to do 1 rep maxes because you're having the athlete lift the most weight that they can one time. And so the concern is that could potentially be injurious to the athlete, because if you're maxing out, you're lifting the most weight you can handle, there's a good chance, not a good chance, there's a chance something could go wrong and you could get hurt. And so sometimes coaches are like, well, we don't want that, and so we're going to have them do a rep max. We'll have them do the most weight they can do 5 times. But a thing to keep in mind about that is even though the weight is lower, they're still going to be very fatigued. If that's absolutely the most weight they could do 5 times, that 5th rep is going to be pretty rough, and they're going to be highly fatigued and, again, still susceptible to injury. So just something to consider there. So what I'm saying is I don't know that rep maxes are really safer than 1 rep maxes. Let's see other things. So assigning the training load. So depends on your goal. So helpful. That chart's cool. This chart's much more helpful, I think is the takeaway here. So if our goal is to do, to improve their strength, so we typically want 6 reps or less. And so if we want 6 reps or less, then we come back to this handy chart and we say, okay, so you want them doing higher than 85% of their 1 rep max. So that's the way that works. So in your programs, I would really like to see you make use of this chart and this chart. So if we want to improve their power, same kind of range here. The weights are a little bit lighter, they're just moving them faster. Muscular hypertrophy, somewhere in that 6 to 12 range. Muscular endurance, somewhere in that 12 plus range. And so you can see heavy loads for strength or power, moderate loads for hypertrophy, and then lighter loads for muscular endurance. Now, it's not quite that straightforward because, of course, if you increase your overall strength, that improves muscular endurance. If you lift really heavy, so less than 6 reps, you're engaging the 2x fibers, and so those are going to grow. So you still get some hypertrophy here, but just not as much as you tend to see here. So they're not exact cutoffs like that. Like it's not like, oh, I'm lifting heavy, my muscles aren't growing, or I'm doing really high repetitions, and so I'm only getting muscular endurance. You will still see some strength of that. It's just not as much, right? Which is kind of indicated by this. So there's strength is still on there. It's just not to the same extent as muscular endurance if we're doing that high rep So we already kind of talked about this, but it's very similar information, just in a slightly different graphical format. So if we want to train for strength, higher 85% or higher of their 1 rep max, 6 or less reps. If we want to do power, pretty heavy stuff, relatively low reps. So that's one thing I would tell you though, is if you're having an athlete do Olympic variants, typically we keep the number of repetitions on those pretty low. So heavy weight and then usually 3 or less repetitions, certainly no more than 5. I know I'm familiar with some high school programs that would do like sets of 10 or 12 on power cleans. That really defeats the purpose, because the idea behind a power clean is to move the weight fast, to move heavy weight fast, not to do a bunch of reps. Doing a bunch of reps is more of a hypertrophy thing, and that's not really what we're going for with the power clean. So just something to keep in mind: if you're doing the Olympic variants, you want to keep the number of repetitions 5 or less, preferably 3 or less. Muscular hypertrophy, 67 to 85% of the 1 rep max, 6 to 12 reps. Muscular endurance, less than 67% of the 1 rep max, and then more than 12 reps. So one of the things you'll see too is sometimes programs will use like heavy days or goal days, whatever they want to call them. So if, for example, we're going to have them do their 5 rep max. So let's go back to this slide. So we're going to have them lift 87% of their 1 rep max 5 times. So that's going to be a pretty high intensity. That's a big training stress. So then we have them, let's say we do that on back squat. So then if they do that on Monday, the next time they come back on Wednesday, they're probably not going to be fully recovered. So maybe for deadlift or leg press or whatever exercise, we're going to have them do 85% of their 5 rep max. And so they're not doing as much weight as they possibly could. So that's a pretty common number, is on those lighter days, or so they're calling that main day the heavy day. So on non-heavy days, you have them do actually a percentage of their repetition max. So again, like 80% of their 5 rep max for that. And this is like some of the older powerlifting programs I'm familiar with. Like you would, for example, squat heavy on Monday, and then you'd come back on Friday and maybe you do 85% or 80% of what you did on Monday on Friday. So it's still heavy, but it's not as heavy as you could go for that load. In terms of timing load increases, so one of the things to keep in mind, and again we talked about this in 345, is that the body maximizes adaptations to a particular stimulus probably about every 4 weeks. So you want to change something, whether it's the intensity, the rest periods, the number of sets, those kinds of things. We want to change those at least every month. Often there are more frequent changes than that, but it's easy to get into a rut and kind of just leave the program the same. So if you leave the stimulus the same, the adaptations stay the same. So in terms of timing load increases, like I said, at least once a month, although they mentioned this, the 2 for 2 rule, which is that if the athletes can perform more than 2 repetitions to their assigned goal, so let's say they're supposed to get 5 and they got 7, and then if they're able to do that for 2 consecutive workouts, so they get 7 twice in a row when they were supposed to get 5, then we can increase their weight. And you might say, how much weight? Good question. So in our less advanced athletes, for upper body exercises, 2.5 to 5 pounds, lower body exercises, 5 to 10 pounds. Our more conditioned athletes, our more experienced athletes, they may make a 10-pound jump on an upper body exercise and 15 pounds or more on a lower body exercise. But in general, the load increase is somewhere between 2.5% and 10%. So 10% is always a good number in terms of increasing training volume or intensity. Most textbooks will use that number. This stuff you're familiar with. So volume, total amount of weight lifted in a training session. And again, we can do that in terms of tonnage. Sets, repetitions grouped together. I won't read the slide to you, but you're familiar with most of these concepts. Multiple sets versus single sets. Depends on their training status. So our inexperienced athletes or people just training for health can get away with 1 set. But the more advanced your training age, the more experience you have, the more sets you're going to need to do. So our better conditioned athletes may end up doing 5 sets of certain exercises, whereas our middle school athletes may do 1 to 2 sets. So the more advanced the training age, the higher the volume, and typically the primary way to increase the volume is to increase the number of sets that they do. And then related training status, even if you have an experienced athlete but they haven't been training for a little while, they're going to be pretty sore after 1, maybe 2 sets, and then we're going to increase the volume in terms of the number of sets after that. Very similar slide here to one of the ones I showed earlier. So if our goal is strength, 6 or less reps, we talked about the percentage of 1 rep max, and then 2 to 6 sets depending upon the athlete's conditioning and also the athlete's experience. Hypertrophy tend to have lots of sets there. If we want muscular growth, that tends to be high volume. So 3 to 6 sets. Muscular endurance, 2 sets of high reps is a pretty common way to do that. Same information, just not on the table. And then rest periods depends upon the goal of the training. So if they're doing strength, which means they're lifting heavy weights, we're going to have them do relatively long rest periods. Maybe it's even 8 minutes or longer, because we've talked previously about the creatine phosphate system taking 8 minutes or maybe as long as 10 minutes to recover. So you're going to, if they're really maxing out on strength, you're going to have them take really long rest periods, as opposed to if we're going for hypertrophy, anywhere between 30 and 90 seconds. Standard is about 60 seconds. So you'll do a set, time yourself, wait 60 seconds and do another set. And then muscular endurance, as you'd expect, relatively low rest periods or short rest periods between sets, so less than 30 seconds. Same information, not in table format. And that is it for Chapter 7. So like I said, one of the things that I would do is to make good use of the tables. There are some really helpful things in terms of designing your program for the end of semester project, but also there's some really helpful things if you're genuinely designing some resistance training programs for yourself or for athletes to figure out how much weight you should be lifting, and number of sets and reps and rest time and all that stuff. So I would definitely encourage you to take advantage of all the useful tables that are in that chapter. So that's it for 17. We'll move on to 18 next time, which is plyometrics. So we will see you then.